Charles Panzram was an American serial killer with a story filled with hatred, deep loathing of society, unquenchable rage, and rebellion against authority. His methods of murder were brutal, including strangulation, poisoning, arson, slitting throats, and cracking his victims' heads with a blunt instrument. At the last moment of his life, he stood in front of the gallows like a soulless monster. He said, "I wish all mankind had one neck so I could choke it." When someone asks him if he has last words, he snarled, "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're fooling around." On Sunday, June 28, 1891, on a remote farm in East Grand Forks, Minnesota, a German immigrant couple gave birth to their seventh child, whom they named Charles Panzram. It was a time when most immigrant families were very poor, and Charles' family was also poor, and his parents were very mean. For example, Charles and his 6 siblings had to travel to the neighborhood school every day to get an education, but their parents brusquely demanded that they skip school and go back to work on the farm. This went on until the truancy laws came into effect, which meant Charles and his siblings could finally go to school. However, their parents were furious because they saw the children as their slaves. So they forced them to go back to the farm straight after school and work until late at night, then go straight to bed in the fields. If the children made mistakes at work, the mean parents would put them in chains and not allow them to eat. A few years later, their father left the farm without any news and never came back. He didn't leave any alimony, just leaving their mother trying to support the family alone. In fact, the 6 brothers don't get along too well because they grew up in a poor family where it seemed to them that the strong were the ones who could dominate the weak. Charles is the weakest, so he is often beaten up by his brothers for various reasons that don't make sense. Later on, Charles wrote in his autobiography, "Everyone felt free to kick and beat me as much as they wanted to cheat me and lie to me, and they thought it was perfectly normal." A year later, at the age of 8, he was taken to court for the first time on charges of drunk and disorderly behavior. 3 years later, he broke into a neighbor's house and stole some cake, apples, and a revolver. Upon returning home, he was severely beaten by his brothers. Although he gave the items to his neighbors, he was arrested for burglary. After a court trial, he was sent to the Minnesota State Correctional Institution, where there were about 300 boys, ranging in age from 10 to about 20. The rules were organized and administered by in-house personnel with no outside supervision. When Charles first arrived at the correctional facility, he was taken to a dark room where a staff member examined his penis and rectum and asked him if he had ever committed sodomy or masturbated. While he was at the correctional facility, he got a lot of training in religion. When he misbehaved or didn't finish his coursework, the strict administrators would put him in a small room to be beaten. The room was called the paint store because when the boy came out, he looked like he was covered in paint, but it was actually bruises from the beatings. Charles was abused by different staff members every day, which led to a strong dislike and hatred for the institution and for religion. He believed that these were the root causes of his misery and wanted revenge on the institution, so he built a crude incendiary bomb. On the night of July 7, 1905, he set off an incendiary bomb in the school's workshop, which started a fire that spread rapidly. The alarms of the correctional institution continued to sound while he just lay quietly in bed, looking out through the window at the ever-growing fire and the overwhelmed administrators. A few months later, having become a cunning liar, he applied for parole from the correctional facility, and when he appeared before the parole board, he behaved like an obedient child, an example of successful rehabilitation, so he was rightfully allowed to leave the Minnesota Correctional Facility. Later on, Charles wrote in his autobiography, "Christians taught me how to be a hypocrite, and I learned more about stealing, lying, hating, burning, and killing, even to the point of making me understand that a boy's penis can be used for purposes other than peeing." When Charles returned home, he learned that 4 of his 5 brothers had fled the family home, that another had died in a drowning accident, and that his mother's mental state had become very fragile. Charles said in his autobiography that, "Mother was too dumb to know anything good to teach me," he said years later. "There was little love lost. I first liked her and respected her. My feelings gradually turned from that to distrust, dislike, disgust, and from there it was very simple for my feelings to turn into positive hatred towards her." Charles returned to the farm, but he didn't want to do hard manual labor, so he convinced his mother to send him to the nearby Emmanuel Lutheran Church. There he got into an argument with a teacher who repeatedly beat him with a whip, so he managed to get his hands on a pistol and brought it to the church, where he tried to kill the teacher in front of everyone, but he accidentally lost the pistol, a plot that failed, and then he was kicked out of school and returned to the farm. 2 weeks later, he hopped on a freight train and left the Minnesota farm for good. He became a drifter, but it wasn't long time, he says. He was gang raped by 4 tramps. It left him traumatized and angrier than ever. He was sentenced to a year in prison at the Montana State Reform School for burglary within months. He weighed close to 180 pounds at the time, which drew special attention from prison guards. One of them targeted Charles, beating him repeatedly. Charles was furious and found a hard board. In the evening, he took advantage of the guard's turn to sneak attack on him and seriously injured him. And then he was held in solitary confinement for a period of time. In 1907, Charles escaped from prison with another inmate, Jimmy Benson. They stole a couple of pistols from a nearby town and headed for Terrytown. Over the next few weeks, they stole and set fires as they roamed around. When they reached western Minnesota, they each took 2 handguns and hundreds of dollars and parted ways in Fargo. Charles then changed his name to Jefferson Baldwin. In December, he arrived in Helena, Montana, a town with virtually no law enforcement and where the locals went out every day wearing handguns. One night at a local bar, Charles heard a speech by a local Army recruiter. That night, he lied about his age to join the U.S. Army, where he was assigned to Fort William Henry Harrison, a remote post in western Montana. On his first day of enlistment, he was charged with insubordination for refusing to work. Over the next month, he was incarcerated several times for a variety of minor offenses, such as frequent drunkenness, disobedience of orders, and failure to observe military discipline. In April 1908, he stole $88 worth of clothes and was caught by military police while trying to escape. At his court-martial on April 20th, he admitted to 3 counts of theft. In May, he was handcuffed and shackled and taken to the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. There, he was beaten on numerous occasions and his feet were chained to a 50-pound metal ball that could not be removed, even when he slept at night. At the time, his job was to collect rocks in a quarry, working 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. Day after day, he became increasingly bitter and angry. Charles was released from prison in August 1910 when he was only 19 years old and had no literacy skills to find suitable work. And he had suffered years of physical and mental abuse with no family to care for him. Therefore, he decided to take revenge on the society and go to hell with others. In the summer of 1911, Charles was arrested for stealing a bicycle in Fresno, California. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison, but he escaped a month later, and then he climbed aboard a freight train heading northwest, taking some guns with him. When he saw 2 vagabonds also hiding on this train, he tried to rape them, but a railroad policeman also entered the train and tried to extort money from them. But he took out a pistol and threatened the unsuspecting policeman and took his watch and wallet, and in addition to this, he raped the policeman, and then he drove all these people off the train and continued his drifting career. In 1913, under the alias Jack Allen, he was arrested in the Dalles, Oregon, for highway robbery, assault, and sodomy of his victims. 2 months later, he managed to escape from prison and was then arrested in Harrison, Idaho. He escaped again, but was arrested again in Chinook, Montana, that time serving a 1-year sentence at the Montana State Penitentiary for burglary. He managed to escape again on November 13th, but within a week he was arrested again for burglary in a small town called Three Forks and sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment under the name of Jefferson Rhodes. On March 3, 1915, Charles got out of jail with a new suit of clothes and $5 and a ticket to a town 6 miles away. He traveled by rail through Washington, Idaho, Nebraska, and South Dakota. On June 1st, he broke into a house in Astoria, Oregon, and was caught while trying to sell some of the stolen items. On June 24th, he arrived at the Oregon State Penitentiary, and when he registered his information, he said he was from Alabama and that his job was stealing. Charles's disciplinary record shows that on January 1st, 1916, he was tied to a post for injuring a prisoner with a hammer, causing a disturbance in his cell, and verbally abusing an officer in public. A month later, he was punished again for attempting to escape and carrying a dangerous weapon. Despite the regular punishments, he kept on with his behavior. In fact, he got the idea that he wanted to take revenge. So, over the next few days, he started several fires in different parts of the prison and also burned down 3 buildings. But this led to him being put in a darkened room without a single light until 2 months later, when he was transferred to a regular cell. In 1917, he helped a prisoner named Otto Hooker escape, but this prisoner shot and killed the prison warden during his subsequent escape. The murder caused such an uproar that the prison's guards became stricter, and 24-hour round-the-clock patrols were introduced. Charles got out of prison on September 18th, and then he also broke into a house and stole some clothes, food, money, and a .38 caliber pistol. A few days later, a police officer recognized Charles from a wanted poster and tried to arrest him. Charles then pulled out a gun and opened fire on the officer, but he was arrested again because he ran out of ammunition. He managed to escape from the Oregon State Penitentiary for the second time on May 12, 1980. He sawed through the bars of a window and jumped right off the wall. The prison guards who arrived on the scene kept shooting at him, but he still managed to escape. In August 1920, he saw a luxurious house at 113 Whitney Avenue, so he broke a window and tried to steal something valuable. Then he found a large amount of jewelry, bonds, and a .45 caliber automatic pistol in the study instead. After taking what he could, he left with a bag of stolen goods. He went to Manhattan's Lower East Side, where he sold most of the jewelry and bonds. He used the money to buy a yacht he named Akista. As Charles wanders aimlessly through the streets, he comes up with a plan to rob and murder. He hires a couple of sailors, takes them to his yacht, gets them drunk, then sexually assaults, robs, and kills them. Over the course of a few weeks, he kept going into the South Street neighborhood and picking his victims. All he had to do was say that he needed some sailors on his yacht and promise good pay, and plenty of people would want to apply for the job. Charles said he'd go to New York every day or two, look for sailors in the area around 25 South Street. Once he had convinced them to come on board his yacht, he had served them some good food and drinks. When they were so drunk, they'd go to bed, and when they were asleep, he'd take out his .45 caliber automatic pistol and end their lives, and then take a stone and tie it to each of his victims before throwing them into the sea. When a major storm hit in late August 1920, the Akista crashed to pieces on the rocks and Charles swam to shore and barely escaped. In 1921, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison in Bridgeport, Connecticut, for burglary and unlawful possession of a loaded pistol. After completing his sentence, he joined a maritime union involved in a labor strike. During a confrontation, he was arrested again for participating in a shootout with police. He then escaped from prison and fled Connecticut, and a few days later he made his way to Africa. At that time, he started working for the Sinclair Oil Company. While he was working in a small coastal town near Luanda, a young black boy of about 12 years of age came to stop him from doing his job. He then took the boy to the Sinclair Oil Company grounds, where he sexually assaulted and stoned the boy to death. After the murders, he returned to Lobito Bay on the Atlantic coast and lived in a fishing village for several weeks. The locals thought he might have been involved in the murders, but they never could prove it. A few weeks later, Charles hired 6 locals to take him into the jungle to hunt crocodiles. They rode into the jungle, and when the 6 locals went down to the river, Charles took his gun and shot them one by one in the back. Even though they were all on the ground, he took his gun and shot them again in the back of the head, and then he threw them into the river to feed the crocodiles. Charles later said, "To some ordinary people, killing 6 people at once seems like an almost impossible feat, but to me, killing those 6 black men was very simple." After that, Charles went north along the Congo River. On the way, he robbed some farmers in a local village and got enough money to buy a boat ticket to the Canary Islands. But there, he couldn't find anyone worth robbing, so he got on a ship that was headed for Lisbon, Portugal. When he got there, he found out that the local authorities knew about his crimes in Africa. So he managed to hide on another ship that was going to the United States. He came back to the United States in the summer of 1922. Charles' life has been pretty chaotic, to say the least. He's never stayed in one place for too long, and he knows the police are always on his trail, ready to arrest him for crimes he committed months or even years ago. So when he commits a crime, he leaves the scene quickly. He might hop on a train, stow away on a cargo ship, or hitchhike. On July 18th, on a hot afternoon, he met a 12-year-old boy named George Henry McMahon. This little boy usually spent his time in a neighbor's restaurant until Mrs. Margaret Lyons, the owner of the restaurant, sent him to run an errand. It was about 2:15 p.m. Mrs. Lyons let George to the A&P store for milk and gave him 15 cents before he left the restaurant and headed down Boston Street. About an hour later, another neighbor, Mrs. Margaret Crean, saw George walking down the street with a man wearing a blue suit and hat. That man was Charles, and he walked with George to a nearby store where he even ventured to talk to the clerk. A few minutes later, he convinced George to take the trolley bus. They got off the train about a mile from where they boarded and went to a pretty isolated part of town. They stayed there for about 3 hours. During that time, Charles sexually assaulted George 6 times, then smashed his head with a rock and shoved several pieces of the paper torn from magazines down his throat. After that, he covered George's body with a tree branch and left the scene pretty quickly. As he was leaving the scene, 2 local residents happened to be passing by and noticed the nervous stranger. However, the 2 residents didn't think anything unusual was going on. After the murder, Charles returned to New York. George's body was found on July 21st. The local police and community formed a search party and detained any suspicious strangers they found. This included a pedophile who had attacked several local children. But it wasn't until 1928 when Charles was detained for another murder in Washington, D.C., and after those 2 witnesses saw him again, that they were certain that George's killer was the same man. On the night of August 26, 1923, he broke into the train station with an axe. There were dozens of suitcases there at the time, and he intended to steal some money from them. He had already opened a few suitcases when a policeman on early morning patrol passed by. The policeman had a gun in his hand, but he wasn't afraid. He took an axe and fought with the policeman. The officer overpowered him and took him to the Boston Road police station. There, he identified himself as John O'Leary and was charged with 3 other burglaries after admitting to the earlier thefts. The next morning at the courthouse, the judge set his bail at $5,000 and sent him to the county jail to wait for the grand jury proceedings to start. While he was in jail, Charles knew he couldn't turn back because the Oregon State Police were after him. And he'd already committed a lot of undetected burglaries and robberies in Kingston and on his trip up the Hudson River. So he told the prison guards that he was a fugitive from Oregon, serving a 17-year sentence for shooting at police. The Larchmont police then sent an inquiry wire to Oregon, and on August 29th, they received a reply in which he learned that Charles, known in Oregon as Jefferson Baldwin, was a highly wanted fugitive with 14 years left on his sentence. A few weeks later, Charles was indicted by a grand jury for the Larchmont burglary. He thought he had made a deal with the prosecuting attorney to get a shorter sentence by pleading guilty. However, the prosecutor failed to perform and he pleaded guilty but was sentenced to 5 years. In October 1923, he was sent to Dannemora prison, where the guards mistreated him. They stripped him naked and took his property. He tried to make incendiary bombs to burn down the workshop, but the guards caught him. He also tried to attack the guard, but also failed. The work in the prison was very hard and the food was terrible, so he tried to escape. But during the escape, he fell down and was seriously injured. He didn't get timely medical attention, so he was crippled in one leg and had one of his testicles cut off during an operation. Even so, he kept up his evil deeds, sodomizing prisoners and plotting various mass murder plans, such as blowing up railroad tunnels and bridges and poisoning the water supply in the village of Dannemora. When Charles was released from Dannemora prison in July 1928, having survived 5 years, he was determined to get revenge for his treatment at Dannemora. In just 2 weeks, he committed a dozen burglaries and killed at least 1 man. However, he was arrested and sent to the Washington, D.C. prison, where he made comments about killing children, which caught the attention of the guards. Soon, other states launched investigations, and a number of other jurisdictions viewed him as a wanted and dangerous person. At the time, there was a 26-year-old guard at the prison named Henry Lesser. He was the child of Jewish immigrants. When Charles was being processed, Lesser asked him what crime he had committed. Charles laughed and said he was reforming the people. In the weeks that followed, Lesser noticed that the odd man rarely talked. He tried to escape by peeling back the concrete around the window bars, but the other inmates tipped off the guards, and then the guards handcuffed Charles to a wooden pole and tortured him for a day and a half. During that time, he cursed his parents and threatened to kill everyone when he got the chance. That very night, Charles confessed to multiple murders of young boys, and the news was picked up by the media. The Washington Post also reported on the multiple murders he confessed to, including the murder of the Philadelphia newspaper boy and George Henry McMahon of New Salem, Connecticut. He just kept talking more and more without showing any remorse. For some reason, Lesser, who works at the prison, is sympathetic towards Charles, who is disliked by the other inmates, but he helps Charles buy cigarettes. In return, Charles agrees to write his own life story for Lesser. With a pen and paper, he describes his past, which is filled with hatred, depravity, and murder. Beginning with his birth on a farm in rural Minnesota, Charles recounts thousands of crimes and dozens of murders committed between 1903 and his detention in a Washington, D.C. prison. He blamed his surroundings for his current state, and he believed that other people made him who he was. Charles wrote a 20,000-word confession that included details about the murders, which have since been confirmed. He also discussed his history of arrests in the 1900s and 1930s. At the time, Communication between law enforcement agencies was limited, which made it easy for criminals to avoid capture by changing their names, because Charles was arrested under multiple names. Charles doesn't just write about his life. He also speaks out against the criminal justice system and the influence of society. He believes that these factors contribute to crime rather than reducing it. He argues that society creates criminals, and he attributes his violent behavior to those who tormented and punished him. He also talks about his criminal journey across several continents without feeling guilty or remorseful. He felt that crime and violence were his way of responding to the world, and he didn't care if his victims were involved in his suffering. He believed that someone always had to pay. On the evening of October 29, 1928, Charles was indicted for murder in Philadelphia. He was in jail in Washington, D.C. at the time, and the indictment charged him with strangling Alexander Ushek on July 26, 1928, on Point House Road. Meanwhile, after the Salem, Massachusetts Police Department got wind of Charles' arrest and confession, the chief of police had two witnesses to the 1922 murder of George Henry McMahon come forward for identification. Both witnesses then confirmed that Charles was the man they had seen that day. The Washington police were also contacted by the Oregon State Penitentiary, who asked that Charles be held as a fugitive from justice. On November 12, 1928, Charles was found guilty, and Judge Walter McCoy sentenced him to 15 years for the first count and 10 years for the second, to be served consecutively, which meant he would spend 25 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. In 1929, perhaps Charles also realized that there was no longer any possibility of him escaping, so he wrote a letter to Salem District Attorney Clark, in which he confessed to George's murder, added that he had committed a total of 21 murders, and threatened them that he would continue to kill people if he ever got free. At the prison, Charles is assigned to the laundry, where he is responsible for organizing and washing prisoners' clothing. His supervisor, Robert Warnke, is a short, bald man convicted of minor infractions who often uses his supervisory position to abuse his power. From the beginning, the relationship between Charles and Warnke was very bumpy. Because of him, Charles received many written warnings and was also held in solitary confinement. When he was released from solitary confinement for the last time, Charles told the other inmates to stay away from Warnke, saying that he wouldn't live long. He also hinted at a new move in a letter to Lesser, stating that he was ready to change things and wouldn't be long. On June 20th, 1929, while Charles was working in the laundry room, he picked up the 4-foot iron bar that was leaning against the door to support a wooden crate, then raised the bar high in the air and smashed it into Warnke's head, which instantly cracked Warnke's skull. He roared, "This is for you, son of a bitch." The trial began on April 14th, 1930, and the judge asked Charles if he had an attorney, to which he replied that he did not need one. The judge suggested that he could accept free appointed counsel, and he cursed the judge loudly. Asked to plead guilty, he snarled at the court, "I plead not guilty. You guys prove me guilty." The prosecutor then called a number of witnesses, including the warden, 5 guards, and 10 inmates. They all said that they saw Charles repeatedly hit an iron bar into the unconscious Warnke's skull. In the end, Charles was sentenced to death and was executed on September 5, 1930. He saw the death penalty as a relief and resisted calls for a moratorium on executions. He said he was looking forward to being executed and was angry with organizations that petitioned for his pardon or commutation of his sentence. On May 23rd, he wrote to the Association for the Abolition of the Death Penalty. He expressed his gratitude for their efforts and hoped that they would be strangled by themselves one day. On May 30th, he wrote to the president to express his satisfaction with the trial and judgment and reject any pardon or sentence reduction. On Friday, September 5, 1930, Charles was taken out of his cell to the gallows. Before his death, he was still cursing his mother and all mankind.